Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Will be joining us for the BrainWaves webinar on positive psychology and student wellbeing. My name is Priya, and I'll be your host for this afternoon. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a very experienced panel from the world of education and academia. First, I'd like to introduce Michelle Titherley. Michelle is a senior lecturer in psychology and at the Department of Psychology, University of Chester. Her research interests focus on how the principles of positive psychology, positive education, and a strength-based approach to teaching and learning can impact the well-being of students. She's currently editing a book on positive psychology for the Emerald Points series, which will be available later this year. It's great to have you, Michelle.
Thank you.
So Gavin is Deputy Head Pastoral at Allen's School in London and Chair of the governing body at Harris Academy, South Norwood. Allen's was one of the first schools recruited as a BrainWaves research school, taking part in research and trials with the University of Oxford. And Gavin contributed as an author to the BrainWaves Key Stage 5 lesson on managing stress. Lovely to see you, Gavin.
Thanks, Priya.
Next, I'd like to introduce Julian Turner. So Julian is Director of Education here at BrainWaves, responsible for developing a curriculum of mental health lessons for secondary schools and colleges. Julian is also Deputy Chairman at The Day, an online student newspaper that turns stories into lessons, and was previously Chair of Governors at the Le Swap Sixth Form Consortium. And finally, we have Tracy, who is our content manager at BrainWaves, who's looking after us behind the scenes and will be available on chat. So if you want to ask any questions or you'd like to know anything further, please do speak to Tracy in the chat. So this webinar is 45 minutes, and as you can tell, it's recording. So if you're watching this on demand, please feel free to sort of rewind at the interest points of your sort of choice. But if you do want to contribute to the chat, just remember it has been pre-recorded, so we can also connect via social media if you have any questions following this webinar. So to begin, I'd like to ask you a quick question. So we're going to actually ask a very quick question via poll. So you'll find in the poll section, Tracy's going to pop a question up, and the question is, how familiar are you with the concept of positive psychology? Okay, so I'm going to give you a few seconds to kind of let us know whether you're very familiar, quite familiar, or not at all familiar. So it'll be very interesting to see how much knowledge we have before we really begin this discussion. So if you would like to start the poll now. Let's see, is that popped up?
Priya, just a quick note. I think you might have to be responsible for that, actually. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Can you see the polls and where they need to be launched?
Yes, of course. There we
Sorry
go.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, so I'm going to launch the poll right now. There we go. So how familiar are you with the concept of positive psychology? I can see the percentages moving up and down, so that's very interesting. And look, if we're not familiar at all, you're in the right place. We've got the right experts here to be able to really go into that in detail. So far, we've got 11% saying very familiar, quite familiar is very much in the middle, 59% there, and then not familiar at all is coming in at about 38%. So there's a bit of a mixed bag there. I mean, personally, I wasn't very familiar with the concept of positive psychology. I read a bit about it, and then I actually started to realize I do know more than I actually realized. So it'll be very interesting to see what exactly are the key principles of positive psychology. If I can start with yourself, Michelle, it'd be really great to understand what is positive psychology.
Okay, lovely. It's quite funny because I got asked this yesterday in a lecture with students, and I said, I'm a positive psychologist. And the response was, is there such a thing as a negative psychologist? So, but I like the fact that you said, Priya, as well, that actually you're probably doing a lot of positive psychology. And I think this is one of the issues. We are probably doing a lot of it, and particularly if you are a teacher who cares about your students. Positive psychology, in a nutshell, really identifies the fact that there is another half to everything that we know based on psychology. And I think when we think about what we have learned from psychology, it's been very much about treating what needs to be fixed, what might be broken. It's very much a deficit approach. And it brings people to that kind of normal level. But what happened at the turn of this century, and it was Martin Seligman, who was one of the co-founders of positive psychology, he had been talking with his colleagues about, well, what about those people who flourish? What about essentially the other half? What about the good things in life? What about the fact that some people overcome adversity? So what positive psychology does is that it actually looks in the same scientific way as traditional psychology. It looks at what makes life most worth living. So there's a real focus on the strengths. There's also the idea about we can build what is already good as opposed to repairing what needs to be fixed. And actually, it's about improving the lives of everybody. So it works on lots of different principles, but it draws very much on some key areas, in particular that we have this upward spiraling effect of positive emotion, and just actually understanding the impact that we can feel when we feel positive, how much more motivated, engaged, creative. That's really drawing on that upward spiraling effect. But it doesn't deny the fact that you also have negative things, that you can have well-being, but still have mental illness. It recognizes, though, that this is also the other half of what we really need to be looking at. One of the things that one of the people in the chat actually commented on was being interested in VIA, which for those people who've never heard of it, the VIA are really the values in action, authentic character strengths. And that really is what is the backbone to positive psychology. So we all have these 24 authentic strengths in different levels. And essentially, it's when we use and apply those that we can get that greater level of well-being. So I think in a nutshell, that's what positive psychology is, but it also recognizes as well that being well, having well-being is not just about being happy. To have hedonic well-being, yes, positive emotion is important, but actually what gives us greater well-being is the understanding that there's meaning, that there's purpose, that there's positive relationships, and that there's this sense of achievement. And actually, that is what we talk about when we talk about PERMA and the wellbeing theory from positive psychology.
Wow, how interesting. Amazing. So I would like to draw attention to Julian and Gavin, because you're, particularly have a link with schools and, as governors and also part of that sort of structure. So in terms of to what extent do you think schools are currently using any of these principles in their teaching? I'd like to sort of pose that question to you both. Let's start with yourself, Julian.
Thanks, Priya. So I should say that I'm also very involved in education in Camden, where I'm a director of Camden Learning. And in Camden, which is a very diverse population, where there are pockets of real deprivation, as well as some very wealthy areas in Camden. Mental health is, it's a very, very big deal for schools at the moment, and it's particularly after the pandemic, but also in the period before that. And I think many of the brilliant teachers that I come across in my work there are exercising principles of positive psychology without necessarily labeling it like that. So that it's kind of built into what they're doing, because it's about that focus on the child's own self-awareness and self-development. So I think there is a lot of it going on, but I also think it's very helpful to attach that label and think about it in a bit more structurally, because otherwise I think you do tend to get a focus on the negative, on the conditions, if you like, on the negatives, and everybody is worrying about, am I in this group or that group, or how many of these do we have? And it's a little, that labeling impact I think could be quite negative. So I think I see both sides of it.
Thank you, Julia. And what about yourself, Gavin? What are your thoughts?
Look, it's interesting this, because I came relatively recently to this. So the past couple of years I've been looking into this more significantly. First of all, reading Martin Seligman's books, and then as you're reading that, the notion occurred to me that actually a lot of this is happening. And I completely support Julian's assertion that actually it's just about shifting that lens and kind of getting people to recognise that this is present. Schools have been structured for a long, long time around the principles of PERMA, for example. You know, we recognise that as personal development, it's about enabling children to find stuff that they like and they enjoy doing, that brings them happiness, you know, that they can engage with. Through that, they find something that they can engage with more thoroughly, you know, their thing, I suppose we label that, don't we? We encourage them to develop and grow positive relationships and to think about how they contribute to them as much as what they get from those things. And then we encourage them to contribute really, really positively to their community. And of course, you know, through the notions of high fives, rewards, merits, lollipops, whatever it is we use to reward children, we recognise them through achievement. But for me, the crucial part of this is getting students to recognise they have ownership of this stuff, to hold up the things that they do for fun and the things that make them feel good, and to, you know, attribute to that importance, so that, you know, when those rainy days come, you know, when those challenging situations arise, which, you know, we have structurally as part of education, rightly or wrongly, you know, through the examination process, they don't narrow down. They hold these things as having value. They know that they are important to them and they're important to their well-being. And that they, you know, we talk to students a lot at Alliance about investing in themselves, building this stuff up over time, developing, you know, this sort of this sense of self and the things that are good for them and the things that hold meaning for them, so that, you know, when those challenging times arise, they're well equipped. And that kind of is that message. It's just moving the lens, identifying the pieces of the puzzle that we already do, thinking about whether or not we could maybe enhance ourselves in some other ways or develop in some other ways. And I think that can be a really, really interesting piece for schools, just to sit down and look at all the great work they're doing and just be willing to kind of, like, for want of a better word, brand it up a little bit, shift the student lens onto it and get them to, you know, place value on this stuff that actually we know matters, but just get them to think about it slightly differently.
Yeah, like shifting the focus, as you mentioned. Brilliant. You've both actually mentioned the term sort of PERMA. Michelle, could you extend a bit more on what PERMA is, just for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically, it's an abbreviation of what the 5 pillars of well-being are. So, and this came out of research that looked at, you know, what is it that provides a good life? And in fact, you know, there's some great videos with Martin Seligman talking about those 3 lies which led to the PERMA model. So the PERMA is a framework. It's one of the most commonly used frameworks that's being used in schools at the moment, even though it wasn't designed specifically for schools. But what it recognizes is that there are these 5 pillars that really give you this sense of well-being. So the P is for positive emotion, the E is for engagement, the R is for positive relationships, the M is for meaning and purpose, and the A is for accomplishment or achievement. And that's recognizing that it's all of those different areas which are really important, giving us both that sort of sense of flourishing, that sense of well-being, ranging from, you know, hedonic well-being, life satisfaction, positive emotion, right through to engagement and meaning and purpose.
Thank you so much for that breakdown. Be really interesting to see what the teachers in the chat are thinking about this this framework, actually, and I'll read out at the end. So based on that, so we know that it's not a new term, positive psychology. You know, it's been around for several decades. How robust is the evidence base for positive psychology? And if we look at, say, for instance, reducing mental health disorders and improving well-being, and also providing better outcomes specifically for young people, because we know there's a huge gap in understanding like what young people go through at certain periods of their time, which obviously the BrainWaves trial is helping with plug that information. So what are your thoughts on that in that sense?
For me, yes. Okay. What is really wonderful is that it is interesting because a lot of the principles do come from the humanist approach, but what positive psychology has done is that it's given this kind of title to all of these different scientific concepts that we now exploring. And one of the things that's really great about it being, well, it's now 23 years, I would say, if we think about it coming around in 1998, is that we're now getting lots of systematic reviews. And that's basically where we've got researchers who are looking at all the evidence that's been accumulated. There is a lot more of that kind of robust empirical research, the sort of research that we can rely on, that is out there. And overall, the consensus is that there are benefits, both in terms of enhancing those personal resources, but also as a consequence, reducing the levels of mental illness, depression, anxiety, stress tend to be the ones that we see a lot that's mentioned. But I think it's really interesting as well, when we think about what a positive psychological intervention does, it doesn't set out to actually address a deficit. So the benefits on well-being and the consequences in terms of reducing mental illness are something that would happen through positive psychology, although you never design a positive psychology intervention to address or fix that mental illness. But the research is coming out there. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think what is being recognized is that there is a bias on a lot of the work that's being carried out in America, North America, in Australia, not so much in the UK. There are limitations in terms of sample sizes and robustness of measures, but essentially these systematic reviews which are coming out are showing significant benefits of positive psychology on mental illness, as well as increasing those personal resources. And I think when you're thinking about what are the benefits for young people, well, actually, it's that recognition that we can be building those resources for all of those challenges that children experience, those transition points, moving from, preschool to primary school to secondary to further and tertiary education. We can actually start to equip them with the challenges of life. And I think that, things like academic success is something that is being associated with improved well-being as a consequence of what that well-being gives you. And I think that recognizing all of those issues that can be barriers to success in students is something that positive psychology is scientifically and robustly showing to be beneficial.
Thank you, Michelle. So, Julie, sorry.
Can I drag that into the weeds a second? Because I think that sort of practically applicable piece of this is really important. I think, look, I've said this before, and without getting on a soapbox, I think it's quite extraordinary actually that educational settings are being asked to become clinical settings in some sense, right? And as much as many schools are fortunate in that they can deploy and employ the services of trained clinicians in the way that Michelle is, and other practitioners. I mean, that's obviously remarkable. But actually, 90% of the staff that are working with children in schools are not clinical practitioners. But what we can do is we can take a scaffold and a framework like that positive psychology presents, including not just PERMA but other aspects of it. And we can apply that to our work with children in a way that fundamentally, will cause no harm and can enable children to think about some agency around this stuff. I do think part of our challenge around the adolescent mental health situation in the UK at the moment, but certainly globally as well, I suggest, is that actually we are still preoccupied with, for want of a better analogy, pulling children out of the fast-flowing river. And actually, we need to be doing some stuff in terms of enabling them, keeping them out of that, or enabling them to swim and to deal with those strategies. And I think all the while that we are reactive, as much as we must contribute, and we feel we must contribute to the reactive work that goes on to support children, all the while that we are reactive, we run the risk of being overrun in schools. And for me, in the educational settings that I work with, this provides an opportunity to get out in front of some of this work. And it's interesting what the research is starting to show in terms of the impact on, mental health and mental illness. But fundamentally, this is probably the very best fit, in my opinion, of the work that we can do with children to enable them to have agency around their own well-being. Because if they're not tackling this on an individual basis, if they're not owning this themselves, then actually you know, we're just not equipped to deal with the potential volume of that. So we shouldn't avoid this proactivity. We should be really getting a hold of this, stepping into this, leaning into this work to get out in front of it, because the reactive stuff, I'm afraid, it's brilliant work that is going on out there. And, you know, I take my hat off to all of my colleagues out there that are, for want of a better word, fighting the good fight. But if we're not getting out in front of it, it is tough. It is going to be really, really tough, and it's only going to get more challenging, in my opinion, as a teacher and a practitioner, as opposed to a clinician.
Yeah, David in the chat has just said he totally agrees with you, Gavin. A lot of pandering and avoiding rather than proactively and putting the right steps in. They need to be prepared for the future. So thanks for that, David. Julian, what are your thoughts? Bringing it back to sort of the brainwaves and, using positive psychology and developing a curriculum for mental health, and just, tying in with what Gavin was saying, I suppose.
Absolutely. Gavin, I totally agree with what you just said. It's that agency is critical, because that's actually the one of the origins of brainwaves was a concern amongst the psychiatry team at Oxford that the fighting the good fight interventions you're talking about, we just don't have the resources to be able to deliver that at the scale that is required or needed across the country, and that we need to find scalable interventions that are going to make a difference in the long run, long-term strategic interventions which are practical for schools and also rely on the skills that teachers have or in schools and can easily develop, rather than a completely different set of skills. So the idea of the brainwaves curriculum, which is one of 3 legs of the brainwaves project, I'll just briefly explain that the brainwaves is trying to do 3 things. We're trying to create a curriculum of education around mental health. We're also building a group of research schools, of which Gavin's school is one, and I'd ask anyone who is listening to this, interested in this, who is interested in their school becoming a research school, please do get in touch. And research schools are enabling their year 12 students in this year, and it'll be year 13 next year as well, to take part in a cohort study so that we can build a sizable long-running cohort where we can actually see some of the evidence for some of these changes in action, and understand a little bit more about causation as well. And then the third leg is that we're doing a number of interventions in these schools, which are again practical, scalable interventions around particular areas of school life and culture. And the very first thing we're doing right now, which is what actually the research schools are doing this term, is we're looking at the way at young people's attitudes to giving consent about passing on information about themselves, because actually until we address that issue about consent to access information, everything else is impossible. So we sort of, but we're starting with that, learning more about that, and then we'll be going into the cohort study proper next spring. So within all of that, that's for the research schools, but actually we're also producing lessons. We produced so far 6 lessons in for Key Stage 5 aimed at year 12 students, which are available to everybody. And we're now constructing a program which will be built into an entire curriculum running from Key Stage 3 through to Key Stage 5. And that curriculum, which we'll be creating over the next 18 months or so, is based on those 5 PERMA principles, which I see lots of discussion about in the chat, which is great. But actually, we're adding 2 other things as well. So one is critical thinking and information literacy, because there is this overlaps with another issue around where young people are getting their information from. And so there's running through like a thread alongside the thread of trying to build agency is a thread of information literacy. So thinking about, how do we trust the information we get? How do we evaluate it? How do we connect that information with practical things in our lives. And along, so that's theme number 6, and theme number 7 is around how all of this links back to the neuroscience. So the changes that are taking place in the brains of young people, which carries on going all the way through school and continues into university and past university, and sort of my children are dotted along this sort of a path at the moment at different stages, and of course they're still changing. Sometimes I like to think that I'm still developing, but I've got a chance, but maybe not exactly in my brain. So we're looking there at the relationship between the brain and the body and things like sleep. We did a webinar last term on sleep with Professor Russell Foster, and that's a huge issue. The relationship between well-being and sleep in schools is going to be one of the themes of lessons in each of those key stages. So that's what we're doing. And I suppose the final thing I'll say about it is that each of these lessons, they're not designed to be a mechanism for young people to think, I've got this issue, do I have this problem or not? It's designed instead to provide very practical, simple, evidence-based things which we know there is good evidence for, that they can do themselves. Very, very simple. Just try it now. And then to think about that and develop a plan, reflect on that and develop a plan for themselves, even reflect on their own experience. So in the stress lesson that you mentioned earlier, one of the things we ask people to do is to reflect on their experience of doing GCSEs and what worked for them and how they managed to try to develop their own understanding of themselves and their strengths. And those strengths you mentioned also are absolutely at the heart of it. The first batch of lessons that are coming out for Key Stage 3 will be focused on strengths and relationships. So anyway, lots going on, but that's what we're doing. Sorry, that took a bit longer than I was planning.
That's fab. Thank you, Julian. I just want to remind everyone, all the participants that have joined this webinar, that you can ask questions in the QA, which we will actually start going through in about 5 minutes. So do drop your questions in the QA panel. So moving on to sort of some of the frameworks surrounding Ofsted. So positive psychology, in terms of Govan and a Gibbsian school culture, how does it relate to the new Ofsted framework? Gavin, if I can start with yourself.
Okay, look, one of the joys of this, and one of the joys of doing the piece of work with BrainWaves in terms of producing the resources, was it kind of cuts through a lot of that. The relevance of this stuff is at a really sort of fundamental level in terms of how it impacts and how it affects children and adolescents' development in their school. And so, Ofsted pre-COVID were making sudden moves towards like the whole personal development piece. COVID kicked in, that's kind of like rode back a little bit, but now they're coming back with it. It's similar in terms of independent sector. They're starting to really focus on individual child development, and their sort of well-being is now absolutely front and center. This piece of work, and positive psychology in particular, but equally the piece of work that BrainWaves is doing, it kind of cuts to the quick in this, because as Julian said, these children, I'm a fervent believer that actually the research that's coming out around neuroplasticity in adolescence, I think is absolutely going to change the way we see things and how we do this stuff. These, we've been talking about it for years, but these people are absolutely in the process of, inventing themselves and becoming who they want to be. So this, embracing this aspect of positive psychology, and I'm glad someone mentioned via character strengths. Schools spend a lot of time, don't they, talking to children about how to do things better and how to improve themselves, in inverted commas. But what about, how much time do we spend on talking to children about their route to doing things? What are they great at? What's their pathway to doing this stuff? Ties in so closely to the piece of work around neurodiversity and how we're gonna support children with neurodiversity. Well, how about what's your route to achieving these things? What are your strengths? What are your character traits that set you apart? And of course, we must be focused on self-improvement and developing knowledge and understanding, but asking children about, how does this land best with you? How do we get this? How do we get this to you? How do you get from A to B? is kind of falls in line with every framework that Ofsted, regardless of who's running the show at the top end in terms of education vision. It falls in line with all of that because it just cuts through the nonsense. It just takes it straight to the children. What enables them in terms of them becoming the sort of people that they want to be, and we as a society hope they'll become, and also, how much can they take themselves there with us sort of guiding them and steering them and putting frameworks and structures in place along the way. And I think that is something, like, just to bring it out of that sort of fundamental level. I think the one thing that I would suggest that schools are considering and school leaders are looking at is, what of your frameworks and structures facilitate the work that we're talking about around this, and are there any in there that might be barriers to it? And those don't have to be really big, meaningful things. One really interesting thing, I think, is that for years, mental health leads have been directly tied to DSLs. I think that is a really interesting model. If we think about what we're talking about here, and we think about the role of the DSL, if you can bring it about that you absolutely partition those two things, and the mental health lead, or the wellbeing lead, as we could talk about it, is driving positive aspects of development and growth, and the DSL is leading on the necessary, crucial work of supporting children, of our most vulnerable children, then suddenly you've got a really interesting combination and a direction of travel for this stuff. And there is no framework around Ofsted or education that is going to fly in the face of that. They will all support that mechanism. So, how does it fit? It fits. And actually what it is it's potentially future-proof. That's the crucial bit for me.
Brilliant, thank you. Michelle, I just wanted to a really quick question regarding, are there any potential drawbacks or challenges associated with applying positive psychology principles to children's development? We've obviously spoken about a lot of the great benefits, but the challenges might be something that maybe holds people back, especially in a school setting.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's really, really important is that every child is individual. You know that when you teach them. And one of the things that's really important as well with positive education, which is positive psychology applied in schools, is that teachers and students and even parents all work together on this. And in fact, talking about ownership, getting the children, the students involved to talk about what might work for them. Positive psychology is not a panacea for all. It's not prescriptive. It's not saying you've got to do this. It's saying that these are ways that people can be empowered to actually grow and thrive and flourish, put that pre-intervention stage in, which Gavin was kind of referring to as well. So there are lots of challenges. And I think one of the other challenges is the fact that, is the UK ready for it? And I think that as teachers in schools, you're the ones who can make the difference, because you're the ones who can have the conversations, look at your school's needs, look at how your school works, look at your students. There's nothing that can harm the child, only if you, it's like anything, we can teach them about history in a history lesson. Obviously, you have to be cautious about how you frame things depending on your audience, but there's nothing within the positive psychology approach that's harmful. And that's why it's not about treating mental illness. It's about building on those positives, which gives them the resource toolkit. But there are challenges, and it takes conversation and lots of support. And, but you don't have to be a qualified practitioner to be able to embed it.
Maria, can I jump in there? There's a couple of things came up in the chat, which I think are really interesting, connected to what Michelle was saying. So, somebody was asking about, is positive psychology useful? Can it provide helpful strategies for dealing with absence, long-term absence, and also around the attainment gap as well? I think those are two really, really interesting areas, big current educational challenges. And as Michelle says, I don't think this is it's not a panacea. However, when you look at the young people that are absent from schools, and obviously there's a very significant overlap between economically disadvantaged children and also children absent from school. There is a question of hope in there. There's something around, do you have that inner hope that leads you to believe that you can do something about your own situation. And I think there's now how you get to those children obviously is very, very challenging, but there's something quite children generally, in my experience, are actually interested in this stuff. It's quite kind of interesting and engaging. So it's more interesting, engaging than some of the things that are talked about in school. So I think it could be a way potentially of getting people getting people back into school.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julian. That leads us quite nicely to some of the questions that have come in the question and answer panel. I'll start with a question from Helen. Are you able to direct us to some relevant research? So some of the things that we've spoken about today, is there anywhere that anyone can sort of be pointed to? Michelle, if I can start with you.
Yes, read my book. No, I mean it's without kind of pushing it. One of the things that's without promoting the book, I think what I have realized from editing the book is actually there is nothing really out there to help schools and educators. And I've done a lot of reading around, and there is a lot of stuff that's out there. And I'm very happy to put together a list of some really user-friendly, quick resources. The VIA, I think, would be one of the websites I would direct people to. The positivepsychology.com website has got some great stuff. Very simple, very approachable. Somebody had put together a taster of brief positive psychological interventions as to give teachers an opportunity just to see how simple it can be to apply these things and probably recognize that they're doing it already. So I'm very happy to put something together and obviously for BrainWaves to be able to share it with people on this, because there is a lot of stuff there without having to go down a big quagmire.
Michelle, you're actively being asked to plug your book. There's somebody saying, what is Dr. Tithany's book called? So
okay. Well, what we are putting together is it's an Emerald Points series book. So it's a small book. It only takes up to 50,000 words. But what we have designed is essentially 8 chapters. And the idea is that within each chapter, we are focusing on positive education at all levels. So we have a level that looks at primary school and preschool, one at secondary, one at higher education. We also have a chapter on positive psychology for parents, because they play a very big role. And also the parents benefit from the well-being that the children bring home. And that's a really important thing to do. We're also looking at how we can evaluate effectively. I've written a chapter on positive education for positive educators, which essentially is flagging up the benefits for the well-being of teachers, because that's also important. You can't teach well-being if you haven't got your own well-being. And it's a two-way sword. If your well-being's low, the children suffer, but also vice versa. And the final chapter, I'm just trying to think, it probably brings it all together, but it's very, very short. Now, each chapter will have a case study of an application. So one of the projects I've been involved in is called the Hummingbird Project, where we've taken a positive psychological intervention that has been run by master's students in psychology. So what this is showing is that actually this is something that teachers can very simply implement, and it's been effective as well. But also, so we've got a case study of an FE application. So that was the one chapter we didn't have, but we've got somebody who's written about their practice. And the book ultimately has lots of signposting. So I have put guides for teachers to find out more resources, but freely available resources. So yes, I'm very excited about it. But yes, hopefully it's something that it will help, because that's what I want it to do. I want it to help educators embed it.
Well, if you put together that list of suggested resources as well as your own book and so on, then I'm sure we'll be happy to send it out to all of the people who have joined the webinar as a follow-up. So that would be great.
Brilliant. We've got another question from Terry Bright. I understand that there are problems at secondary, but surely primary would be a better place to start, as the earlier the better with mental health and well-being. I currently work as a well-being and pastoral lead at a primary school, and we are seeing a lot of teenage behaviours are making an appearance younger and younger. That's very interesting.
I totally agree with that. So you've obviously taken a sneak peek at my notes, because my ambition is that we take BrainWaves down to primary. I say it's my ambition because BrainWaves, I should say, is entirely philanthropically funded. So none of these resources are paid for. Everybody's time on the project and all of the research is entirely funded by donation. So if you know any rich, powerful foundations that would like to support this work, please also put us in touch with those, because this, we want this to go on for a decade or more. The longer these projects go on, the more benefit you get from it. And the information platform we're building at the University of Swansea, which is going to be holding all this data, gets more and more valuable as time goes on. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It should be in primary. The only thing I'll say is that, again, my experience is that primary schools, because they tend to be organized with a teacher staying with a class over a long period of time, they do a lot of this stuff very, very well already. And but I think, yeah, we absolutely will bring it down to primary one day when we get the money.
Brilliant. Thank you. And we've also got another question from Louise Auckland. Getting additional material and content into state secondary schools is incredibly challenging. I have extensive experience of this. The obvious curriculum location is PD/PSHE, but this often has limited timetable time and is variably taught. There are many barriers to non-examined content. Are BrainWaves or any panel members involved in national level discussions on changing attitudes or curriculum content to include such well-being based materials? If I can start with Gavin, please.
Yeah, that's interesting. Look, we know, don't we, that those spaces that sit outside academic curriculums are just getting squeezed. The increase in, the volume of RSE that practitioners are having to deliver, statutory content that everyone's having to cover off for all the right reasons. It means that these things are really impacted. So, I completely see that positive psychology lends itself and could lend itself to the delivery of it in that discrete session and in those ways. And equally, it can be those tutor times or those quick grab 10-15 minutes. It does lend itself really nicely to that. What you're doing this week that makes you feel good, what's made you laugh, what's made you happy, we'll do more of that. Those sort of conversations can be really positive. But actually, if you were going to be ambitious about it, but without actually impacting too much in terms of time, if you're a pastoral lead at your school and you're going to have conversations with, you're going to have pastoral conversations, sometimes restorative ones off the back of disciplinaries, possibly, framing those conversations and putting those on the students that you're working with, giving that to them, because actually, I totally take the point about getting it into primary schools. That is really important before the cynicism kicks in. But if there's one thing, in my experience, that adolescents like talking about, it's themselves. So if we can shift this onto them, and in those conversations, it can be, before we talk about, what has happened and this, egregious error in judgment that you've made that we're going to follow up in sort of a very traditional model of sanction, let's have a talk about you. What's going on at the moment? What are you enjoying? What's fun? What are you into? Tell me a bit about what you're plugged into. And it doesn't matter what that is. I don't know. What is it? Basketball? Is it football? Is it Warhammer? Is it whatever it is that's floating these kids' boats? What are you into? How are your relationships? Are you getting what you need from them? What sort of a friend are you? Are you a good friend to the people that are around you? And what does that look like? These conversations as part of pastoral or disciplinary even, or restorative conversations, I don't consider those things as different ends of a spectrum. They're part and parcel of the same piece. Those conversations, part of that, are easy interventions if you can grab some time to actually talk to your teachers. I know that can be really challenging in and of itself, but those are straightforward interventions you can have. As I said, just shift that lens on what you're doing. What if children perceive their sport as not just something that makes them better at sport and that is fun and they're with their friends? What if they perceive that as good for them in that way? What if they perceive that as developing them and growing them and important in that way? You know, what if they start to see it like that? It's just a lens shift. It's not necessarily more. It's just seeing it from a slightly different angle.
I know we're bang on 5 o'clock. I know we're bang on 5 o'clock, but I was just going to say one very quick thing, which is that, so Gary, absolutely, that's completely spot on. I think the BrainWaves lessons are actually designed so they can be broken down into 15-minute activities, 20-minute activities. So I think that helps get them in the curriculum. But yeah, the other part of the question, the questioner raised, there is a lot of interesting movement going on at the moment around thinking about the curriculum, and I think there is an opportunity actually over the next year, 18 months. There's people with really, on the face of it, very different political views have got quite a lot of overlap in terms of thinking about aspects of the curriculum that need to be more child development centered. So I'll leave it there, but I think there is opportunity. So make your voice heard. If you want to see more of this, please vocalize it.
Thank you, Judy. I've just got one last poll before we wrap up. And the question is, what are your plans to introduce more positive psychology in your setting? So yeah, if you can vote. So we've got yes, no, possibly, and not sure. So let's see where we're at. So this would be a nice indicator to see if like people have understood, obviously, the concept. For the people that said they weren't too familiar with positive psychology. So we've got some high numbers of 77/78. So that's a really excellent indicator. So I'll end the poll there. Thank you for everyone that contributed there. Okay, so we are coming to a close now for this webinar. It's literally flown by because it's been so interesting, and I want to say thank you so much to everyone here who's participated. So just before we finish, I just want to remind you that there are currently 6 BrainWaves lessons available to use with Key Stage 5 lessons, and if you'd like to find out more about these, then please visit the website, and the website will be dropped in the chat, which is www.education.brainwaveshub.org. They're all free, and you just need to register your details with us before you download. The lessons are accompanied by teacher notes and scientific guides, and there are also lots of blogs and previous webinar recordings on the site that you can catch up with. We'll also be launching our free Key Stage 3 and 4 curriculum from January next year. So please look out for news of those resources. And finally, if you are interested in joining the BrainWaves project as a research school, and I have seen a couple of things come up in the chat, which is really promising, which will be working with the University of Oxford to trial mental health interventions and questionnaires in your school, then please do get in touch with us. And again, the email address will be dropped in the chat function, which is support@brainwaveshub.org. So thank you once again for everyone who's contributed, and do follow us on social media to carry on this discussion. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.